Good evening. Thanks for coming out. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me as your guest speaker. I am going to set my timer so that I can stay on point. I get carried away sometimes, so I'm going to make sure, okay, we've started, okay? I'm timing myself. So the African American Male Wellness Walk Empowerment Event, Get Off the Edge, Part 3 of the series. Let me review my prescription for health and wellness of the African American male. Number one is see the doctor/counselor as needed. Number two, identify your spiritual leader. Number three, grow your relationships. And number four, work the body. The topic this evening is the healthy spirit of the African American male. What a topic for a psychiatrist. If you look at the flyer, we had the Reverend Iran Watson 2 weeks ago speaking on the mind, and now we have a psychiatrist speaking on the spirit. Doesn't that look like a misprint to you? I don't know what to say about these African American male wellness people, but I think they got it twisted, but I'm going to do the best that I can do. My statement of belief: the mind, body, and the spirit are all connected. What you do to one, you do to the others. But the mind is the interlink. It's the backstage access to the spirit. And so before we can tackle this topic of the healthy spirit, I think we need to tackle the subject of the spirit world. Does it even exist? Now, my job is not to convince you of anything tonight. My role in this discussion is just to get inside your head to create some questions in your mind. If you're driving home this evening, when you lay your head on the pillow tonight, when you're at work tomorrow, if you're asking yourself, is this guy touched? Is he from a different planet? I've never heard of such things. Then I got into your head. I won. That's my role tonight. You know, they say medicine is an art and a science. The science part of it is the research and the discovery, but the art part is the application and the delivery, and I'm good at that part. But I'll declare early on in the discussion tonight, I'm not a biblical scholar. If it wasn't for the internet, I couldn't quote you any references. My father was not a minister or a deacon. My mother was not a typical church lady. She was in and out of church much of her life, but she wasn't afraid to get on her knees and pray, as you'll hear about in a moment. I'm coming strictly from the layman's perspective, although with some psychological training and background. For those of you all that know me, you know I tell a lot of stories. That is my preferred method of teaching. I like to talk, teach, and preach. My wife says, yeah, but the problem is you don't know when to stop. That's why I got this timer up here tonight. And she says, you don't know the difference between the teaching and the preaching. And my answer to her was, whatever. So to explore this issue of the healthy spirit of a man, we first have to determine, does it and the spirit world exist? Wouldn't that be a fair question? So to borrow from legal terminology, there are some articles of discovery. There's to be 3 things that are required to tell if you have had a spiritual encounter. Number one, there has to be an informant. Somebody has to inform you that the spirit of a man in the spirit world does in fact exist. You have to either read about it or someone has to tell you about it. Consider yourself informed. Number two, there has to be some level of doubt. The human mind exists mainly in the physical world, and it tries to make sense of things through the conscious mind, the part we talked about 2 weeks ago. And the conscious mind uses the concept of logic and rationale. It uses the senses of sight, sound, and touch. So when you're talking about the spirit, you can't see it. You can't hear it, maybe. And you can't touch it, maybe. So there's a natural tendency towards disbelief that the spirit and the spirit world exists. And the third thing that is required, the third article of discovery, is you have to have an experience. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of the musician Jimi Hendrix. You're dating yourselves. Jimi Hendrix was from the 60s. He was one of America's biggest rock stars who just happened to be black. And he played the guitar with his left hand. And he was the first one to set it on fire at the performance. One of his biggest hits was Who Knows? They don't know like I know. Da 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 da. You probably had to have been there back in the 60s. So. But before he blew up, he lived in London, England, and that's where he formed his first band. And the first band, he named them The Experience. These British boys could rock. I don't even like rock music, but I listen to Jimi Hendrix. And before he would play in front of an American audience, he would always ask them, are you experienced? Because if you wasn't, you was about to have one. So when it comes to spiritual encounters, my brothers and sisters, I'm asking you the same question. Are you experienced? Brothers, are you still with me? I might have lost a few. Some are already nodding off in sleep, but that doesn't bother me because the same thing happened to Peter at Gethsemane. Maybe he had just had a long day. So a spiritual encounter, I define it as one where something in the spirit world intervenes or makes its presence known in the physical world. And I warn you, when you're having a spiritual encounter, you may not recognize it in real time at the time that is happening. When it happens initially, your mind won't even process it. It's only after the fact, after some time has passed, that your mind recognizes it for what it was. I remember driving up I-71 one weekend, and I saw something that crossed the pathway, and I was like, I couldn't believe it. But when I looked at it in the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse, and I went, wow, that was a fox. Same things happen with the spiritual encounters. You can't recognize it while driving forward, looking through the windshield. It's only through the rearview mirror after it passes that it makes sense. So I'd like to take you on a journey of my articles of discovery, the information, the doubt, and the experiences, so that you can better answer that question for yourself. Does the spirit world exist? We'll use a model, that movie Christmas Story, where the ghost of Christmas past took Ebenezer Scrooge on a trip through his life. So let's start with the informant. I'm from Detroit, Michigan, and we'll start this story when I was in junior high school. That's what they call middle school now. And this was in the 1960s, and I went to Foch Junior High. And what's significant about that is I took 3 buses to get to this middle school, and in elementary, I could walk. And some bright person had built the middle school right next door to the high school, about 50 feet away from Southeastern High School, the roughest high school in Detroit, the home of the Jungleers. What kind of mascot name is that? Well, the name did fit because they were a wild bunch. And some other bright person decides that they were going to let the high school thugs out a half an hour before the junior high school got out. Not good. So what the thugs would do, they would wait around to jack us up and shake us down for the bus money. And it didn't take much for me because I was small at the time. And they would grab me in my collar and lift me up off my feet, and there goes the bus money. I was trying not to get smashed up. And so it was a long walk home through some rough and unfamiliar territory. If the neighborhood thugs didn't get you, their dogs would. I could hear it now. What are you doing walking through my hood? I'm like, look, man, I already been jacked up and shaken down. I ain't got nothing left. Can I please get a pass through your neighborhood, Mr. Thug? So after a while, the boys from my neighborhood, we started to gather inside the school before they let us out, in groups of about 6 or 7 for safety, just to get to the bus stop. Sometimes we would run into one of the thugs that had jacked us up, and I could hear that James Brown music playing. Payback. I can do wheeling, I can do dealing, but I don't do no dang squealing. That's a fact. Get ready, you mother, for the big payback. So 2 of the biggest 7th graders, they would do the frontal assault. They would attack this guy from the front. One of the others would come around to the side. We'd grab a hold to his leg so he couldn't dance while he was fighting and he couldn't run. And one would jump on his back to bring him down, just like the lion does to the water buffalo on that National Geo channel. And the result was a feeding frenzy. So it went from that to taking things from the store, to entering the bus through the rear door without paying, to beating up the remaining few white kids who was left in that school system. Payback for the assassinations of one of our most popular presidents, John F. Kennedy. Of course, that was before Barack Obama. And the assassination of our national leader and national spiritual leader, Dr. Martin Luther King. On one particular day, we was chasing this kid, and you know we had perfected the takedown technique by then. My mother happens to drive up to the school to pick me up. And I don't know to this day why she did that, because that was certainly not part of her routine. She was no soccer mom. So when she got there, she was shocked by what she saw. And she had seen enough. She told me to gather my belongings, and that was the last day I saw of Foch Junior High School. The very next day, as part of my punishment, I was in Catholic school. Overnight, I went from beating up white kids to being outnumbered by them 50-1. Also, not good. I still jacked a couple of them up, though. Not really, but I thought about jacking a couple of them up, and I threatened quite a few before I settled down and made some friends. But it was in this Catholic school, the 7th grade, where I became informed about the Spirit. I made some discoveries. First discovery was that there was a required course on religion. Yes, apparently you could take a class on it, and I had to take the class on it. And I learned about religious history. I learned about the Passover and how that became part of the Jewish identity. I learned about the Last Supper and communion and how that became part of Christian identity. And I learned about religious customs. I learned how to genuflect. I learned how to sign. And I learned how to chant, and with your spirit. And we also went to church every week on a Wednesday. And that's where I got to practice the routine, the genuflecting, the signing, and the chanting. And that's where I learned about the Spirit. Now, true to Catholic tradition, I had not come within 10 feet of a Bible, but we had manuals and workbooks. That was our homework, and there was lots of it. I didn't even have time to think about beating nobody up once I got to this Catholic school. I learned about the Spirit through reading and oral tradition. Now, when I heard about the Spirit and the spirit world, I was like, I really had no reason to think that the Catholic people were lying to me about the Spirit, but Although they have lied about some things in the past, some in the recent past that we're still trying to wrap our heads around and get over. But I didn't think they were lying to me about the Spirit, but I had no experience. So let's move on to a couple of my spiritual encounters. Let's fast forward my life to college years. I have escaped the Catholic school system, and now it's the 70s, and I'm a pre-med student at Western Michigan University. First ever in my family since we crossed the Atlantic on the Mayflower. And you know that's not accurate history because that was the Spanish that crossed on the Mayflower. My people were the Africans, and we crossed on another kind of boat. And we had another kind of experience on the Atlantic. But anyway, I'm there and I'm holding it down, and one of the required classes was physics, amongst biology, chemistry, calculus. Physics was the most intimidating. I had never taken it in high school, but surprisingly, I was doing well. And I was in Professor Buckley's class, who was teaching physics. I was getting all 90s on the lab experiments, and I was getting all 80s on the exam. And he made an announcement before the final. He says, if you are satisfied with your grade, you do not have to take the final. And the calculus was wearing me out, and the biology was wearing me out, so I went to his office, and he said, you have a B. I said, thank you, Professor Buckley. And so I didn't take the final. I studied for the other classes, and when I got home over Christmas break, looked at the card, physics, it said a C. I didn't think much about it. I thought it was an honest mistake. I had to deal with my mother, who was on me like white on rice about these grades, and I assured her I would get this corrected when I got back to school. When I got back to school, I made a case appointment at Professor Buckley's office, and I went and explained the situation. You told me I had a B. I'm expecting a B. I get my card, it has a C. Can we get this grade changed? We have a mistake here. And that's when he said, no, 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 no. It's not a mistake. You should have taken the final. You were less than 1/10 of a point from the B. And so I pleaded my case. I said, Professor Buckley, the reason I didn't take the final is because you told me I had a B. But there must be something we can do. With your own admission, I was less than 1/10 of a point from the B, maybe an extra paper or something. He said, there's nothing I can do. All right, so I decided to take matters into my own hands because there were some things that I could do. And I got up from my chair and I went around on the side of his desk, and I was getting ready to deal with this man. I was feeling angry and disrespected, and I was experiencing rage. And as I was going in for the assault, I heard a crystal clear voice said, Alvin, stop. It scared me because he and I were the only two in the room, and he didn't see it. He was backpedaling by now. So I told the man, I said, I'm going to leave your office before I kill you. That was the mid-70s, about 35 years ago. If I had followed through on my plan, I'd just be getting out of Jackson State Penitentiary about now. I'm going to move to the last encounter. Fast forward to medical school. This is the late 80s, and now I'm a resident doctor in training, married with kids. Imagine that kind of stress. And when my wife was carrying our middle son, who I call the anointed one, she went in for a routine ultrasound, and the OB doctors found that this kid had fluid on the kidney. And they consulted with the head surgeon in pediatric urology at Children's Hospital of Michigan. His name was Dr. Alvin Pelt. Now, at the time, I was a surgery resident. That was before I switched over to psychiatry. And I was studying to be a urologist. Dr. Perlmutter met with us, and he decided my son was no immediate danger. So he said, we'll wait till he's about 2 or 3 years old, and we're going to operate, and we're going to repair this kidney. So now when he was about 2 or 3, it was time for surgery. And of course, they wouldn't let me go back to the operating room because this is my son, so I had to wait in the waiting area with my wife and my mother. And Dr. Perlmutter said the surgery would take about 3 hours. So in the waiting room, I started to pray, and I imagine many other families in that waiting room was praying, and I was silently, of course. My mother, however, got down on her knees and leaned over the coffee table in the waiting room and started praying out loud. It was so embarrassing. About an hour into the surgery, Dr. Perlmutter comes out of the operating room, and he knew this would concern me. And the first thing he said was, "Do not be alarmed. Your son is fine." Then he said, "There are some things that happen that I can't explain. We've seen this defect in the kidney for 2 years, but when I opened him up and dissected down to the kidney, there was nothing to repair. It was perfectly normal." He said, "I've never seen anything like this in 30 years of practicing surgery." You see, Dr. Perlmutter couldn't explain it. Maybe he had not been informed. Maybe he was not experienced. Things were happening in real time that his highly educated, Harvard-trained brain didn't have time to process. Now, my mother, in her simple ways, she could explain it. She was jumping up and down and giving praise for this spiritual encounter, which I call a miracle. Something in the spirit world had intervened in the physical world, and it had performed surgery. So in closing, let me just say a few things. Man does not live by bread alone. That was in Matthew chapter 4, verse 4. And that is a most definite statement that there's more to us than flesh and bone. I think Michael Jackson said it best in a song on that Off the Wall album. It's just another part of me. A part that requires your mind to gain access to. One that requires the 3 articles of discovery. You have to be informed. There has to be some doubt, and you have to have an experience. I'm here to tell you that the spirit lives in the body, but you can only access it through the mind. What do you think will happen to it if you house it in an unkept, broken down body? Will it become a broken spirit? What do you think will happen to it if you possess a dirty mind? Will it become an unclean spirit? I don't have the right credentials behind my name to correctly answer those questions for you, but there are people in this audience that does. This is why the prescription for health said, identify your spiritual leader so that you can nurture a healthy spirit. You need to develop a relationship with such individuals. And I recognize a few of those individuals in attendance tonight. And the first is Reverend Iran Watson. Is he here? He spoke earlier. Also, there is a Bishop, Fred Marshall, pastor of Samira Missionary Baptist Church, Columbus, Ohio. Bishop, would you stand for a moment? Identify yourself as I call your name. Another spiritual leader is Reverend Roger Mosley, associate minister of the Mount Period Baptist Church, a co-worker of mine. Thank you, sir, for standing. Another spiritual leader is Reverend Michael Curtis, known as Reverend Big Mike, pastor of the Second Baptist in Delaware, Ohio. Thank you, sir, for standing. If there are any other licensed ministers, please stand and identify yourselves as a spiritual leader. Thank you, sir. Well, listen, my clock is ticking. I think I'm 4 minutes over. I've had so much fun sharing my stories with you. I've had so much fun acting out with you. I hope that we can do this again sometime. Thank you so much.